was that this was the first presentation I ever made for the Pulaski County Historical Society. And it was because of Dr. Richard Clark's prodding and pushing on me to do this presentation in 2010 that I got my history interest in history. And I've kind of continued with it ever since. I've done a number of talks over the years for the Historical Society and other groups, and I enjoy doing it. It's always fun. Um, the story today is about a short line railroad that didn't last long. It came into the scene in about 1904, and by about 1921 or two, it had just about disappeared. You know, part of the old railroad lingered on for years after, but uh, but it was nonetheless very important to the early development of Little Rock. It's hard to imagine, if you can picture, that in 1900, the forest of Pulaski County going on west into Saline and beyond into the Ouachita foothills and the Ouachita Range was the last stand of virgin timber east of the Rocky Mountains. It was a land that was very sparsely inhabited, right in Pulaski County, the most populous and capital county of the state, was still very sparsely populated west of Little Rock. Very few homesteads, a land of vast expanses of timber. I got my interest in this story from an old article in this historical review written by Fred Hanker in the 1960s. He wrote about the history of Ferndale and later a companion piece in the 60s about the history of the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western Railroad. This little map was just in the back of his article, kind of showing a pictorial, if you will, not truly a map, of the different things going on in the Ferndale area. Now, Ferndale, if you don't know, Ferndale is roughly centered on the crossroads of Canis Road out west of Little Rock in the county and the Ferndale Cutoff, and south of there is the Ferndale Congo Road. There's a lot of things on this map that just fascinated me that I eventually had to study and find out a history of every single one of the things here on this map.
It's not going to work. It doesn't support it on that. You'll have to listen to this.
Why didn't you do it on my phone now?
Are we all right? Palmer Cemetery is shown up here. I had no idea where that was. A spring, Pleasant Grove Cemetery, a White Oak School, the Croson's Mill, stuff all over here. But one thing that really fascinated me is there is a railroad in Ferndale, a railroad. And I just, at first, I couldn't believe it. And one of the first trips I ever made down to the Butler Center, I came across a photograph in the archives there of the Neimeyer lumber camp between Ferndale and Bigelow in 1916. And what you're seeing here is a old Shay engine, SHAY, a Shay engine that was very common, a workhorse in yards and for short haul distances. A very special old machine that was widely used at the time. And you can see we've probably got the engineer and his firemen or brakemen, and they've got the wives with them that day posing for a photograph. My story begins with the Neimeyer Lumber Company, and their assets were so intertwined, they were almost indistinguishable, but it still was two separate operating companies, the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western Railroad and the Neimeyer Lumber Company. In 1904, Andrew Johnson Neimeyer, AJ they called him, purchased $80,000 acres from the St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern Railroad. That is a vast landholding right there. And it included much of present day western Pulaski County and a large portion on into Saline County. And a lot of that timber is still out there today, but now in private, well, still in private hands of the various timber companies. But he bought this from the St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern, which was the principal railroad going through Little Rock at that time. There was others, but it was the first one to arrive and one of the largest. And they had been granted large amounts of land from the federal government as a means to raise money to extend their railroad lines. And they were ready to dispose of some of those land holdings that they had been granted. And that's how this land came up for sale at first. It was rocky mountainous land and it went cheap. One report was $3.50 an acre. I believe it's more like $7 an acre. And the railroad was capitalized initially with 160,000 in stock and 131,500 in bonds. The principal officers of the company, and I like this old photo, they're all standing probably by the old railroad station down at the mill site. They're described as Charles Neimeyer here on this side with the jaunty little bowler hat, and some others going across the line. Mr. Becker here in the middle was the vice president, and he was an attorney educated at Harvard. Never mind, he was a Yale man. And these other two here are not identified in this particular caption. However, that one right there is Andrew Johnson Neimeyer, A.J. Neimeyer. He was described in the book Sawmill as looking more like a worried store clerk than the timber baron that he was. He apparently, though, attended to every detail of the operation of the mill and railroad. His brother was president of another logging company over in Bigelow. Bigelow once had a very, very large operation, and it was serviced by another railroad called the Fourche River and Indian Territory Railroad. It went up through Y, the town of Y in Pulaski, Saline County area, and it went all the way to Thornburg and on all the way to present day Lake Sylvia. The Neimeyer Mill was built in Little Rock beginning in about 1904. It wasn't the first time the Niemeyers had a mill operation. Their first mill was near Malvern, the Saginaw Lumber Company, and due to a number of moves and purchases, their access to the uncut timber holdings were blocked by another company, the Wisconsin Mill Company, Wisconsin Lumber Company. And I imagine that was some corporate skullduggery for that time and that age. But anyway, nevertheless, Neimeyer had to look for new timber and a new site for a mill. The mill was large by the standards of that day, having two large band saws, or head saws as they were called, with a production capability of 100,000 board feet of lumber per day. That is a lot of lumber. It was entirely self-contained in that it had its own power plant, its own boilers to run all the equipment, and steam to operate kilns to dry lumber. And it was enthusiastically received by all the businessmen in Little Rock at the time, partly because of the payroll. A payroll, 150 to 200 workers at the mill, plus up to 100 more working in the timber. The Neimeyer Company was all about the pine lumber, southern yellow pine to be specific, a very valuable lumber even to this day. It's very hard, it's very durable, very strong, easy to mill, and it is still a lumber of choice for many uses. The Neimeyer Company operated a number of lumber yards all throughout the Midwest, stretching from Ohio through to Nebraska. And 40% of all the lumber they cut here in Little Rock, Pulaski, and Saline County was shipped by rail out to those other lumber yards. It also served smaller uses. The Clark and Gay Lumber Company was a hardwood company located nearby them that produced things like tool handles and the many different wooden parts that would be needed for construction of that day, goods. And a smokehouse. Remember, in those years, refrigeration was either new or non-existent. If there was ice available, it often was not generated. There was not an ice plant. It was cut from rivers. So smoked meat was very important for the time, and they needed a lot of hickory wood, and they provided it. Out at the small community that was named by them as Carnes, they had a hardwood mill to serve their needs for bridge and railroad ties and other needs of oak and hardwood, and white oak barrel stave makers. The old plant was located south of what was then called the 19th Street Pike. That threw me for a while trying to find that. I kept looking in the wrong place. Old Asher Avenue today was once called the 19th Street Pike because it met at what would have been 19th Street, except for the fact that Weldon Wright renamed it Wright Avenue in his family's honor, and there is no 19th Street at that location. Kind of unusual, but it was along the 19th Street Pike, It's located right here, if you can see my cursor moving. And oop, am I on the right screen? There we go, right there, if you can see my cursor moving. And that would be Elm Street immediately to the east. And then you've got the 19th Street Pike coming down here, Asher Avenue. Their neighbors at the time were Dickinson's Arkansas Brick and Manufacturing Company, a very large brick maker at that time, and they relied heavily on using prison labor from the state penitentiary that was located just north of them. Guess that would be the intersection right there of Asher Avenue and Roosevelt Road. Roosevelt Road isn't even built in this year, 1913. And further out to the east is the old county hospital at the St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern Railroad tracks. There's still little traces of it left, but not much. We were out there one day looking, and we found these old rails embedded in the gravel and the paving all over this site near where the old mill was located. And a car come roaring out and says, "What are you doing out here?" Of course, they thought we were trespassers or up to no good. And we said we were looking for the Neimeyer sawmill. He goes, "Well, here, come on, follow me. I'll show you where it was." And that old guy was very gracious. He took us onto the property of his business. He had a truck brake refurbishing company, and he goes, "Here you go. Here's the boiler buildings from the old Neimeyer mill." So, as a matter of fact, there is a few old ghosts out there, a few old buildings still remaining of that old sawmill. And this would be located down about at the end of Elm Street, and then to your right, you can see the old concrete buildings there. They were concrete to be fireproof since it was the boilers. They had a lot of stuff going on there, burning sawdust and scrap wood to fire the boilers and keep the plant running. There was another building that's gone now, and I'm sure glad I stopped to take a picture of it one day. But they're up at the corner of Elm and Asher was once the commissary for the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western Railroad. It was reported in the historical articles that it was then used as an ice house, and this looks like a heavy, well-built ice house, very thick brick walls when they tore it down. And then later it was used for storage from the old Pro Window and Door Company, and even they are gone now today. So things disappear so fast sometimes. It just kind of taught me a lesson. Get a picture while you still can. And then at the intersection of Asher Avenue, there's still the remains of the old Neimeyer feed store. It's been gone and closed for many, many years. I don't remember I ever saw it operate. But at that time, there may have been railroads, but it was heavily, heavily relied upon mules for labor, particularly out in the timber. And they would have had large numbers of beasts of burden, if you will, that had to be fed. And in fact, some of their incoming freight on that railroad, some of their largest incoming freight items were coal, feed, and hay. Now, where was this old line? I kind of showed you a little bit about the old line and how it come along here. It'd be south of the modern day Pulaski County Jail unit, coming around to Elm Street where the Neimeyer mill was and everything. Whoop, I'm kind of pointing in the wrong way over there. Come across Asher Avenue at the feed mill and continued on and went actually right across the property. It crossed Fair Park at about 15th Street or so and went right across UALR's property. These are parking lots now mostly to serve the Jack Stevens Center. And then it went up along behind the Methodist Children's Home, and you can still see a very big cut behind the home where they cut into the side of the hill to put the railroad tracks down. And then it crossed University Avenue at about I may have told you wrong about where it crossed the street at Fair Park, but it crossed University about 15th Street, and on a very high trestle. It went over Rock Creek, Coleman Creek, went over Coleman Creek and crossed University Avenue on a very high trestle. In the later years, this is much after, I'm going to jump way forward to the end, there was a branch railroad extended all the way to the new state fairgrounds. It was used, I believe, it was both a state and a Pulaski County fairground. I think there's a little bit of uncertainty exactly about that, but one of the first documented users of this railway was the rail spur to the fairgrounds park was the Max Goodman Wonder Show. And I think that gives you some roots for all the different games and attractions and things that lingered on around the zoo at War Memorial Park for many years after. And Rachel Patton might be listening in. She did a wonderful presentation and paper about the old carousel at the fairgrounds, the Herschel Spillman Carousel. But those kind of things that would happen much later in the future probably had their roots to the facts that the circus trains had been pulling up into here to unload and then do fairs and circus and carnival acts here at this site. Uh, that was stayed in use long after this branch line going west to the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western was in use. At the zoo for many years, some of you might remember, because of that old rail spur that went up in there, they had moved up an old steam locomotive, the Fordyce and Princeton, and was described in 1968 as being on permanent display in War Memorial Park. Well, nothing's permanent. It eventually was moved back to Fordyce where it's on display there. The route kept going to the west. Westward it went. It went along the boundary of the Haven Arrest Cemetery. It crossed the interstate. It followed very closely along Rodney Parham Road today and turned, following along what is Markham Street today. Markham would have been a very new road at that time, and it certainly wouldn't have all the development you see there today. There's a minor little error in this map. It was an early effort of mine. I've refined it more, but it still kind of tells the story. It passed by the old Ferdinand Canis home place. And I like the story of Ferdinand Canis. He was a German immigrant. He would have been living there with his family at the time that the railroad come through, right on the edge of his property at Canis Park there. So he certainly knew all about it. Canis Road's named for him, just a credit to his long efforts over the years at being an early settler and a big supporter of good roads in the community around him. That's a whole story in itself, but I just wanted to say, who is Canis? What is Canis Road named for? Ferdinand Canis is the answer. But it's really the whole family. This little boy here, Edward, ended up to be a good friend with County Judge Arch Campbell. And at the time they did the Pulaski County road plan in about 1969 is when the road would have been named Canis Road. The old Canis homestead is still up there on the hill. It used to once overlook, the timber's all grown back, but it once looked down upon the railroad. I don't know how much longer that old building will last. So many of the relatives of Canis now are gone, but it's still sitting up there behind a lot of shrubbery. And it was originally a rough-hewn log building dating back into the, I'd say, 1880s, probably 1887. But there's a little something along the way of the old Neimeyer line, they called it. The nickname of the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western was the Neimeyer line. It kept going on from there, moving out further into the country. These little squiggles here is where it makes an interesting turn through the hills through a city park. And I was surprised a lot of our parks people had no idea that was an old railroad bed. They obviously thought maybe it was a road or something, but they didn't even know it went through the park. The Neimeyer Grove subdivision I put on this map here just because I was surprised that there is still some old lots out in the villages of Wellington named Neimeyer Grove subdivision. Neimeyer had, once he would cut out his timber, he had a lot of empty land that wasn't going to be worth anything for a lot of years to come. So he actively marketed his cutover lands to settlers and others who could make use of the more open land. Certainly it was stumpy and kind of trashy with treetops everywhere, but he had some success marketing his cutover lands, but not always. He platted a subdivision here. This was a very important operation for him in this general vicinity. He called the place, he named the subdivision Neimeyer Grove, but he called the place West Little Rock for a time in his marketing. It just never caught on. It was just too far out. I suspect very few lots were sold, and I can't find any evidence of many houses or no houses, maybe just 2 farmsteads on all this property, but he certainly had an ambitious view of the future. I thought it was interesting too. Carnes Station was in this vicinity, or cairn, I believe is how you'd pronounce it. Cairn means literally a rock pile, and that's what you had in West Little Rock. And he had, it was a very difficult railroad to build at many locations. It required a lot of cuts and rock and a lot of fills to keep it flat enough, low enough grade that the railroad could get in and out of there. And I thought it was interesting he selected for the name cairn or rock pile. Um, in the years right after the railroad come through and was all cut over, the Shacklefords bought land out this way, a very large dairy. And further on to the west of there was Lawrence Spring. Along Rock Creek Trail, if you ever want to just see a little piece of the railroad, you can park. It's really odd, but you park behind the cleaners. The Bowman Curve cleaners is the entrance to the trail, and that trail goes out along the old rail bed. Very scenic and easy walk. Very pretty. Rock Creek's pretty, and I'd recommend it just as an afternoon stroll to go along Rock Creek. Rock Creek Trail is what it's called. I looked and looked for this railroad. When I first started, I had no idea where it went. The only maps I had were crude, hand-drawn maps. It didn't tell you much of anything. Gave you an idea, but exactly where was it? And I'd pondered all the time, where in the world is this railroad? Well, you can see a remnant of that embankment right next to Chenal Parkway westbound at the street intersection of Loyola. And it's big and clear as day. I don't know how I missed it at first. I guess I never look out the side window when I drive out that way, but there it is, big and beautiful. There's a remnant of the old Little Rock, Maumelle and Western Railroad. This is gone now too, but I always liked this photo. When they first built the Walgreens at the corner of Wellington, there's a drive-through window behind the store, and you could stand there at about the drive-through window and look to the west and see Highland Methodist Church. Well, there was an old cut through that hillside, what was a hillside, lining up right with the side entrance of the church. And that's the kind of thing you find when you go out looking for the railroad is just old ghosts of cuts and fills going out through timber from 100 years ago. And this is gone now too. Christian Brothers Automotive dug all that out. The Shacklefords came on the scene, and I put this in the talk just because I wanted you to know a little bit about the time and the places and some of the people anyway along the route. Uh, Henry Hewson Shackleford, or H.H., was the brother of John Dennis Shackleford. John Dennis had a country home and a very large orchard over on Shackleford, where Shackleford Road is today, over in the area of Executive Center Drive. And that's how Shackleford Road got its name, from John Dennis, Henry's brother. Henry had an interesting tale, and I want to tell it because it is kind of fun to tell. He is pictured here with his second wife, and she was quite young. There was quite an age difference between them, and some eyebrows were raised. There's a little bit of scandal that he'd marry someone so young, but he did nevertheless. His first wife ran off. He was a lawyer and a practicing attorney with his brother downtown, and he was just unhappy. And like others that I've run across stories of the time, he wanted to go and live a simple life in the country. Well, the family had some money, and they were able to buy a very large land holding of upwards of 160 acres, probably a little more than that. I haven't really tried to find out exactly, but a very large land holding, stretching from about where Kroger is today and the new Costco all the way up the hill towards the promenade, and east and west in both directions. That was the old Shackleford dairy property. Well, when he announced to his wife that he was giving up the law practice and go be a dairy farmer, that first young wife of his, it was reported by the family, packed up her stuff, got on a train, left Little Rock, and was never heard from again. And the family wonders, did he ever properly get a divorce? They never saw her again, but he didn't lose a beat. He married and had a nice family. And just as a matter of medical trivia, he was the first recipient in Arkansas of an experimental cataract surgery that partially restored his eyesight in one eye. Otherwise, it would look like he would have been blind for the remainder of his days. So I thought that was a fun little story to tell. If you kept rolling out past the old Shackleford Dairy and kept going, you would arrive at Lawrence Spring. Shady Grove community is what it's called. This is at the Canis and Denny split. Well, it's right at Shady Grove is the split. The railroad continued on Denny Road for a very short time and went out through the hills. Another branch went all along Denny Road, and I suspect all the way over what past a trestle at Gordon Road into the hillside north of there, all the way to Chenal Mountain. When you're driving out Canis Road west of the Chenal intersection, you look on the left, and there's a very old looking, and it is a very old building, log hewn 2-story timber home. And it's been there a long time. I haven't been able to quite figure out exactly, but I know it dates at least to 1890, and I suspect earlier than that. It's mentioned in some of the earliest surveys of western Pulaski County when they were scouting locations for a new road. It's mentioned on very old maps from the USGS as having a home there. It's spelled wrong in many citations as the Lawrence House, but it was actually spelled as I have it here, Lowrance, I guess, or Lawrence House. And it was on the side of what once was a tanyard. I don't know exactly where the spring was, but there was a very important spring in the early years, just on the north side of the road, Lawrence Spring. And in the early years, like 1850, it was the site of a leather tanyard. I always throw this picture in here. It's just kind of trivial, but it's interesting. There's a very old looking house with a roof line that you would not commonly see today. It's well kept though, but it's not oriented parallel with the street, and it's not oriented parallel with the property lines. It seems to be randomly placed until you put a plat down to where the old railroad line was, and then the old railroad line ran right along here, right along this side of the house here, parallel with the road. The railroad, that is. There's a big old cut out in Canis Road. It's fun looking for these old ghosts. And they dug that down through hard shale as much as 20 feet deep. And this would be just west of the ballparks for the Pulaski Academy. And it was west of the ballparks. And I got thinking about that. You know, in the old days, they did all that with mules and dynamite. It by hand as hand could be. There was no caterpillars. There was no track excavators. They did have steam shovels and may have taken advantage to that fact. There were steam shovels mounted on rail cars, and as they advanced rails, they'd advance the excavating equipment. But I suspect this was all done by hand. And today it's gone. It's part of a new subdivision, like so many pictures I'd taken back in 2010. You go a little further out and you get to the community of Walnut Grove, and that's at the intersection of Walnut Grove and Canis Road. This is one of the last pictures of what the building looked like when the last congregation was there. Uh, the church was built in the early 1880s on into 1884, if I remember right. It was one of several one-room Methodist churches built out here. Mount Pleasant was one over off of Colonel Glenn Road. There was this one built on Walnut Grove Road. And then there was a third one, Spring Valley, which burned many years ago, and so it's no longer there. But this old church has stood the test of time. There was the last congregation of the members that were there from 1951 when they merged with the Pride Valley Church. Today, Pride Valley is Highland Methodist, and Highlands kind of adopted this old church. They took an interest in it, and one of the Sunday school classes there, led by Peggy and Barney Taylor, made it a concerted and very extensive effort to restore the old Walnut Grove Church. It's still out there today. It's beautifully restored to the point they even put the wavy glass in the windows. They had to lift up the front of the church and put new cypress timbers under it. They did a nice job, and they're very it's a credit to them and their church for what they did to save this old building. They market it now for special events and weddings, and they have added some other amenities to the other side of the grounds, but very, very nicely done. This is a family that lived just south of the old Walnut Grove Church, and they were very much involved in it almost from the time it began. And certainly from the time it began, the Crowson family. And they were present, and they were there when the railroad came through in about 1907. Um, Winfield Crowson is the man here. I suspect he may have been named for Augustus Winfield, an early Methodist preacher, but I have no way to know that for sure. His son Archie here married one of the Shackleford girls you saw a picture of. And his wife here, Martha, everybody called her Maddie, was one of the founding members and secretary of the Walnut Grove Church when it began. They were around when the railroad come, and I imagine Winfield worked for the Neimeyer Lumber Company, and they certainly benefited from it. It cut right through their land, and they brought a measure of prosperity to that area. Unfortunately, their lives were marked by a tragedy later in their life. Um, there are three of those little girls in that picture drowned in a horrible, horrible thing that made national news in 1926. Uh, they were taking the girls to school. At that time, there was a one-room schoolhouse. It rained all night, and the water was quite high. And at the time he started across the creek with a wagon, there was an old rock weir, if you will, a very shallow impoundment of water above that road crossing. Apparently, that part of that dam gave way and washed that wagon away with the girls and Winfield in it. He was an only survivor of that incident, but it was sad, and it was remembered to this day that all those girls lost their life at that event. I'm gonna back up just a little bit and tell you a nice story about this guy on the end. I thought it was very interesting. His nickname was Dub. Well, Dub, the family said Dub was probably autistic, although they didn't know how to identify that at the time or how to treat it. Dub lived at home all his life. In fact, in later years, he lived with his brother, Charles, I think it was. In later years, when Charles and his new wife had built a new home to live in, he lived in the old cabin till his death. So he was born and died in the same building. Uh, he was not able to take care of himself, didn't function well, but he was the grave digger at the old Walnut Grove Cemetery, and he could remember and recite by name all the names and dates on the tombstones in that little cemetery. And I thought that was very remarkable and somewhat telling that he would have a special ability. We're almost to Ferndale. Got some railroad pictures coming up. This is the town of Ferndale right here, the community, although it wasn't called Ferndale when the railroad first arrived. It was more known by one of the prominent residents, the Suttons, who operated a steam mill. And there's another family that's still there to this day, the Douglases. Uh, um, Neimeyer named the place Maumelle Junction, hence the name Little Rock Maumelle and Western Railroad. You see, the little Maumelle River goes through here, and I might even just make yet another side comment. Maumelle was first all south of the Arkansas River. You know, today we've got the town of Maumelle or Maumelle Newtown north of the river. That didn't come about until World War II. Before that, the Maumelle area was all this area south of the river. The Maumelle Post Office, a very old one dating back to 1843, was located on Highway 10, almost to the county line. And it was the Big Maumelle River, or Maumelle River as they called it at that time, and Maumelle Creek, as they call the Little Maumelle today, was all located south of the river. It was just up very recently compared to the history of the area that did the name Maumelle come to be associated with anything north of the river. But anyway, as a side note, something else, something different. What you see here on this map is Prothro's Campground, which was an old church revival campground. Very, very popular from the time after the Civil War all the way through into the 1920s up to the Depression. Was every summer, multiple congregations got together here for their religious revivals. Fred Henker had a nice article all about the activities at Prothro's campground. And it's the same family, George Prothro, that moved later to the east at what today is Protho Junction, but they accidentally dropped the R, and so the family's been mad at the Arkansas Department of Transportation ever since. It's not Protho, it's Prothro's Junction, but that's one of those things that's going to be like that from now on. There was several schools in the area, though, Ferndale, in these early years and even later. White Oak School was first, and later it became the Fletcher School. The Crowson family, or at least a member of that family, a distant cousin, operated a mill on the little Maumelle River, a water mill, until many years after. Eventually, it was owned by Mary Rowland, and she also has a very fascinating story to tell, but I think that'll take a little too long for today. But there's kind of a map of what Ferndale today looked like when the railroad arrived. Maumelle Junction had a Y in the tracks, meaning they could turn a kind of a triangular shaped section of track joined by multiple switches where they could turn trains around. There was a railroad siding in what would in the future become the town of Ferndale. And the most important thing in the early years was a branch of the railroad went all the way north to Highway 10 called the Tram Road. And today that's going to be Garrison Road. Much of Garrison Road today was once called called and mapped as the Tram Road when they were logging that section out of all its timber. Timber camps. The first timber camp was at Ferndale, and it was a big deal. It brought money, it brought cash, it brought, a new experience for all the families living out there, and it brought many families out from town to go work in the timber. Important source of revenue, and a lot of people saw how nice the land was, and a lot of people started buying up land as Neimeyer was done with it and build their homesteads out there. These timber camps, though, were quite crude and remote. Some of the buildings were movable, some were a little more substantial, but a lot of them were built on skids, and they had the ability to load them on flat cars and move them to the next camp. But the timber camp did provide all the amenities. All of them had some sort of store or commissary. So many of the workers brought their families with them to work, say, for the season cutting timber, that they often had schools for the children. And they had an on-call doctor with some hospital capability that would at the camps whenever needed and on a regular basis, just as checkups. In the early years, the doctor rode out on a hand car. That'd be a long ways to pump a hand car to go all the way out to Ferndale from Elm Street downtown. But in later years, they bought an old Model T and outfitted it with train wheels, with flanges that it could ride on the tracks. There was a depot and a post office as well. The camps were pretty crude. This is an actual Neimeyer lumber camp, and it's said to be on the Neimeyer line, but I'm not sure exactly where it is. There was several camps along the Neimeyer line. Ferndale was the first one. The second one was located in Saline County, further west of Ferndale, almost directly west of Ferndale, at Cold Spring. And it would be in North Cold Spring Road if you ever went to look at it. But unfortunately, it's been gated off now as private property. But there's a very large open pasture all through there that would have been the second lumber camp. And I believe the third lumber camp, although I've had a little trouble documenting exactly where it was, but the third lumber camp was Camp Perrin, way out, if you know where that is, on Highway 9. And the camp was apparently so large and dominated that area so much that the old Brazil, town of Brazils, spelled something like Brazil, Brazils, eventually took the name of Perrin, and they continued the name Perrin Post Office. So that's kind of a little piece of something interesting. I thought it looked like the lumber company took over the little town of Brazils. But this early camp was at one of those three places. Although I got to admit, it's possible it could have been in other places. I suspect there was also a camp on what was the Cotton Belt rail line where it crosses Pinnacle Valley Road, because they built extensive network of logging tracks all over that. Some of those lines, those temporary logging lines, even crossed Shenandoah Boulevard and continued on to the west, and some went far back east along Taylor Loop Creek, back towards Taylor Loop and Ensign Road. At the camp, here's a nice picture of some of the men that worked in the timber in those days. And I got a lot of these photos from the family, the descendants of Prather Cypret. And there he is right there with an arrow over his head. Prather Cypret was a big man. Look at, he's a tall, big man with big hands, big gloves. He just looks like he's tough and he can handle anything. His brother-in-law right next to him here, I found out, his name is McEwen, and that family had been in Ferndale for many, many years, for a long while. And I even know some of their descendants and relatives that have come down through the ages. Uh, Thank you, Prather Cypret, for saving those pictures and passing them on to your family. There's Prather up on top of a log. This is his team, apparently, as there was a couple pictures like this. He seems to be using horses here, though, instead of mules, which I thought was a little unusual. I thought that was almost exclusively done with mules, but mules were often used for skidding. They would actually just drag the log, as the name skidding implies. They're going to just skid the log along. They'd have one mule or maybe two pulling a log down to the tracks of the branch lines of the railroad to be loaded up. They didn't like to skid much more than a mile, and really half mile was more desirable. And if it got to be too long a skid to get them down to the tracks is when they resorted to loading them up on wagons. And they had a contraption of poles and pulleys, kind of like a sort of a modified gin pole, to load these big logs up on wagons. And if you'll take a look at that picture there, look at the size of that pine log laying on that wagon in comparison to the draft animals and the men standing there. And if you'll notice, that wagon has 6 wheels, 3 axles. It would have been a major effort just to get it up on the wagon, loaded and ready to move. And now they've got to take it down the road to the railroad siding to be loaded up. I just got to say, those workmen were tough, and they did that all day long, day after day, working in the timber. Back then, it was popular to climb Pinnacle Mountain as a little bit of a Sunday pastime, if you will. Maybe not on Sunday, but as a picnic pastime. Let's go climb Pinnacle Mountain. Nothing new about climbing Pinnacle Mountain, folks. It may be one of the most popular hiking trails in central Arkansas, but they've been doing it for a long time. There's Pinnacle Mountain in the background, and what's remarkable about it to me is most of the trees are gone. They climbed part of the way up that high sides of that hill and got everything they could get. And that's what the operation was all about. They did leave trees behind. It wasn't a total clear-cut operation, but they got everything they wanted. If a stand had a lot of good pines, they were always after pines. If it had a stand of good hardwoods, particularly white oak and hickory, they got that. Whatever there was a market for. These guys here are all lined up with dirt slips and dirt moving equipment. So I'm sure Prather Cypret was out here working, but it may have been for the railroad company. This would have been the trestle of the Cotton Belt Railroad over the Little Rock, over the Maumelle River, Little Maumelle River, near Pinnacle. And it looks like they've got more of a dirt moving operation going on than anything. Get my act together there and advance to the right slide. Here's a crew that had been working on road bed, and that's perhaps what we're seeing is crew working on railroad bed, preparation of it and to lay down tracks. And this is a newly constructed line right here. Not certain what it is, but I suspect it's associated with the Cotton Belt Railroad rather than the Neimeyer line. But I thought it was an interesting photo nevertheless. The same kinds of techniques and same kinds of things were done on both railroads at that time. And here's an interesting trivia question. I wish I had an audience so I could hear, but the men that laid tracks, actually laid the rails, were called Gandy dancers. What a name. Don't know how it come to that, but that is a very interesting name. Gandy dancer. Once they got the logs down to the edge of the branch lines or the main lines of the railroad, they would load them with steam-powered log loaders. And these log loaders would move along the rail cars themselves. They were on wheels or skids of some sort that when one flat car was full, like pictured here, he started loading up at the front end of the train where the steam engine is, and he's working his way back down. And when they leave out, that loader, in this instance anyway, will be at the end of the train with a load of logs loaded up. They were interested in logs that didn't have a lot of limbs. There was no paper companies in those years that were going to take all the scraps. They just wanted the logs. I see I've been talking a little while, so I'm going to go speed it up here so we got time for questions and answers. I spent too long talking about some of the old settlers. This is a Shea engine, and they use these heavily on the branch lines. If you picture, there was a main line, the Neimeyer, the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western, but the Neimeyer Lumber Company operated all the branch lines, and their principal equipment were these small Shea engines. If you look in this picture here, the center of the engine is over here, and the boiler's sitting off to one side. Well, the reason for that is these were gear driven, piston and gear driven engines. They didn't have the tall wheels that the other earlier ones did. These are driven by steam pistons here, pumping on gears and crankshafts that drive the wheels through a gear driven arrangement. And there's the pride of the fleet, the main line. This was bought brand new in 1907 at a cost of $15,000, and it was the single most valuable asset of the rail line other than the rails itself. It's one of two rod engines that they had, and it was built specifically for low speed and high tractive effort because it's got relatively small wheels. These branch lines went all over, and I did touch briefly that the tram road along Garrison Road was one of the most important lines of the train when it got to Ferndale. It continued on all the way to Highway 10, but I'm uncertain exactly how it got there and which route it took from here, but maybe someday I'll sort that out. You know, this story really is a story of looking for old ghosts. And I did find some old ghosts along the way. I eventually, after a lot of effort, found the old Palmer Cemetery that was mentioned in the history of Ferndale in 1960s. And it was hard to find. It had not been used since 1929, and it was truly forgotten. These are old rubble graves marking the site of early graves dating to about 1860. Um, these are shell markers or headstones. It probably had paint on them, and they may have worn away considerably. Just something out in the woods long ago and long forgotten. Just a little fenced in plot. It just, I don't know what happened to the family or why nobody kept up with it, but it's just a fact that's what happened. The whole community disappeared, in fact. It had a mill there. I puzzled over some of the ruins here in this photograph for a long time. There's a embankment and a high platform here, foundation with some bolts, a trapezoidal block. What that was, well, it was an old grist mill, steam powered grist mill. And there was once even a church and school on this site and about a dozen settlers, or well, about 8 settlers. But it just in the 30s, all traces of it disappeared. If you're ever going through Ferndale and you want to know something about what used to be there, well, this old house was called the Wooten Villa. It's the most striking 2-story old house in Ferndale. Horace Wooten ran the commissary at the Ferndale camp, and he would board some of the more important guests of the railroad and workers of the railroad there at his home there on what was then called the Mount Ida Road. I got an old picture here I just like. This is a bunch of people posing in a scene where they've just worked hard all day taking care of the roads out near Ferndale. In those years of the railroad years, you could either pay a millage tax for road maintenance, or you could join for a 2-week period one of the many crews that were out doing road maintenance and improvement. And apparently everybody in Ferndale got together in 1914 to work for Judge Joe Asher, that'd be Asher Avenue, and take care of the roads out that way. This photo, like so many others I've acquired over the years, is from Marcella Grimmett. Her family's been out there since the 1840s, and she was the postal carrier for Ferndale area for many, many years. She knew everybody and everything. Here's a little picture of the old Ferndale post office. It became probably the world's smallest store then for a time after the post office ceased operation. But Marcella said when they took the Dr. Pepper sign in still hand painted letters, it still said post office under the sign. And just a little further west of Ferndale's an old post office, another old post office, the Doe Branch. And it's amazing that's still there. I'm so glad they've tried anyway, to take care of it, put a roof on it, and skirted it in to keep some of the vermin out of it and preserve it a little bit longer. It's been around a long time. I wished somebody will take care of it for many years to come. The line didn't stay at Ferndale forever. They eventually had cut out everything there around Ferndale and along the tram road, Garrison Road. And further west of Garrison, I suspect that those branch lines of the railroad that used the Shea engines went all the way down Bandy Road. I know they did because some of the branches off Bandy Road, we found railroad spikes way out in the forest. So those roads went a long way out from Ferndale and the tram road to the west. But even so, they eventually cut that out. And by 1914, they loaded everything up and headed out to Cold Spring. And then, like I mentioned earlier, eventually they moved on from Cold Spring to Perrin, and that was probably their last lumber camp. They did make it, though, cutting timber deep into the Saline County, all along the North Fork of the Saline River and over towards what is present day water supply for Little Rock. Winona, Lake Winona. And a little bit of overview of the map. It only stayed in operation until 1921. They'd really cut about all the timber they could easily get to. They had a lot of land still with uncut timber on it, but the philosophy at that time amongst the bigger lumber barons and smaller lumber barons alike was to cut out and get out. And I think that was a factor in it. They were just getting into the hill country where it was so difficult to work. Excuse me, please. And following World War I, there was a big decline in the demand for lumber. They just weren't competing well in the more modern world, and they shut down operations. They went bankrupt, in fact. Although I expect filing bankruptcy was an advantage to them financially, as you know, the assets of the companies were all in the companies, and the shareholders and the bond holders had all been paid off by that point, or mostly paid off by that point. And so it was just a matter of disposing whatever remaining assets there was. Much of that land, I don't know exactly what happened, but a lot of that land now is still in private timber company hands. And that's a story in itself to tell you about the old state game refuge and the Ferguson Ranch and cattle herding west of Little Rock. But that's another day. We'll talk about that. This is an interesting photo I found, kind of an art photo along the forgotten line of the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western Railroad. And I'd like to give credit to Fred Hanker, who wrote several nice articles for the Pulaski Historical Review, Clifton Hull, the Short Line Railroads of Arkansas, David Hogue of the Arkansas Art Council, and Kenneth L. Smith for his book, The Sawmill. Love it. Read every word of it. I still go out in that country today. Here we are on the Christmas ride out there. That little red buggy right there is mine, and a few of my close friends from out in Ferndale, we like to go riding out in the timber country even to this day, looking for old ghosts of the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western Railroad. And that concludes my talk for today. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks so much, Mike. We did have some questions come in while you were speaking, so I'll read some out for you. Did Neimeyer Lumber ever use company store tokens or company script for use in the company store?
I really don't know. I know that they were offered freely offered credit at those different company stores, the commissaries. But I really have not run across any script. I have run across on eBay where you can buy old bonds of the company.
All right, another question. Did the line reach the North Saline? We have encountered trestle berms in that area.
Yes, the line went almost all the way to Lake Sylvia along the North Fork of the Saline River. It went a long ways out there. I'm uncertain what, but there because there was no map saved. Some logging roads like the Fourche River and Indian Territory Railroad did have maps showing the extent of all their various branch lines. Branch lines went everywhere like spiders. But I do know that it crossed Highway 9 near the old lodge house near Camp Perrin and continued on quite some distance there. And the caretaker over at Lake Winona that works for Central Arkansas Water said he's found branch lines everywhere out around Lake Winona and west of there. So it went a long ways.
All right, another question came in. Where is the old Canis house?
The old Canis house is at the top of the hill at the intersection of 12th, Rodney Parham, and where Canis Road begins. Go up that long hill and you'll find it on your left on the south side of the road. It's very hard to see now because they've let the shrubbery grow up so tall in front of it. But that is the old Canis home place, and their land holding was very extensive. All of Canis Park, going back towards Haven Arrest Cemetery, all the way to the Briarwood apartment area, all the way west towards Barrow Road, and all the way south towards the boundary of the Barrow Road addition.
All right, we don't have a new message yet. I'll give people a minute to give them an opportunity to compose any questions.
I hope you all
I have a
enjoyed it.
question. Could I ask?
Sure.
What's the source of the word Iron Mountain in this original name of the railroad?
I don't know. I wish you did. I always suspected it was referring that it might refer to the Iron Ranges in Minnesota, but I'm not certain. I don't know where it would have gotten that name.
I don't have a question, but I want to say that I enjoyed the talk very much. It was very interesting. Thank you.
All right. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
All right. A question came in. You mentioned the Cotton Belt Railroad. How did that tie into this?
All right. The Cotton Belt, running west from Little Rock, it would have been the Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf in the early years. And then I believe it was later the Rock Island and Pacific. I guess maybe technically I said that wrong. The Cotton Belt might have been Little Rock to Pine Bluff. But anyway, it was part of the Chicago, Rock Island, and Western. It ran along the route of the present day railroad that's still in operation of a very similar name, the Little Rock and Western. Not Little Rock and Maumelle and Western, but the Little Rock and Western Short Line Railroad along that route had several branch lines that Neimeyer operated. He had the rights to share freely with the other railroads when he needed to, and I suspect he would haul loads of logs out of his branch lines along that road to his mill. The main ones I've identified and know of for sure is, as I briefly mentioned, there was a siding at what was then called Maumelle Junction. No, shoot. You know what? I can't remember. It may have just been Maumelle Post Office. It was on Pinnacle Valley Road, and that branch went all along Pinnacle Valley, along the railroad, and curved up through the ranch. And it was used extensively also. And there's a lot of ruins of old railroad berms and that Neimeyer left behind at that location. I also suspect he did more logging in the vicinity of Pinnacle Mountain, obviously from the photos, and that would have been at the end of East Pinnacle Road.
All right, we had a comment come in from James. I live on Cold Springs Road and just recently found a spike just inside the gate in the pasture you spoke of.
Oh, that's so cool. I actually have a sack of old spikes. It's how I confirmed that what I'm seeing was really the railroad. I would carry a metal detector. The kids that I had a small but deeply disturbed following that went with me on these trips, and we would look for railroad iron.
All right, I think that about wraps it up. Thank you so much, Mike.
All right. Thank you for having me. I sure enjoyed it.